Well, good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to Demos. I'm Miles Rappaport. Many of you know, but many of you are new to Demos tonight, and it's great to see new faces here. So let me say a little bit about what Demos is and why we exist and what we're trying to do in the world, and then introduce somebody who is a fabulous partner for Demos in trying to make the world a different place, and that's Professor Ben Barber. Demos was founded in 2000. We are a policy, research, and advocacy center, sometimes known as a think tank, but I think we have a broader mission in my mind about trying to take certain important values and take them into the public debate in this country, and increasingly, in part through Ben Barber's presence and work with us, into the international arena. What are those values? Well, we have a conservative think tank world in this country that has taken the values of small government, low taxes, ultra-individualism, leave us alone, just let us consume, I might say. And I think we want to be a real counter to that, and to have a better and a broader and a richer vision of what America can be. And the principles that we espouse in order to do that are to expand democratic participation. So we've done a lot of work at Demos over the years on lowering the barriers to participation, encouraging people to come and vote, preventing people from being kicked out of the process or discouraged from being in the process, and that's an important piece of our work. Secondly, we are fundamental believers in economic equity, in lessening the chasm of inequality that has come up in this country. And we do, through our Economic Opportunity Program, have done lots and lots of work on the issue of inequality, around which I'm happy to say there is a real debate in this country where there wasn't even a year or two ago. We've done a lot of work on the scourge of debt, which is connected, obviously, to the issues of consumption that Ben is going to talk about, but increasingly also is because people's basic incomes don't keep up with the necessities, and so they go into debt as a safety net in the absence of a real safety net. And lastly, we are real believers that we need to restore the role of the public sector. We've had a culture over the last 30 years in this country where the market rules everything, where it is not only the engine of economic growth, but it is the engine of cultural norms, and I think we need to change that. So we have in the Public Works program an effort to really reframe the conversation about government and make people understand once again that government is not something external to us, but is the way in which we plan for the future and we solve problems that we can't solve as individuals. So those are the fundamental values that Demos has tried to put into the national debate over the last few years. I am delighted to say that I think, although some days it seemed over the last 6 or 7 years, probably to many of you, like we were shoveling against the tide, as they say, that I think there's been a real breakthrough in this country. And it's in part because of the ideas that Demos and other organizations have put forward that I think have been challenging the kind of hegemony of the conservative think machine over the last 20 or 30 years. One of the ways in which we do this work, two things I want to say about new elements of this work. One of the ways in which we do it is through a number of fellows that are people who work with Demos but have a body of intellectual work of their own that they pursue. Our job is to find the synergies of their values and our values, and to help them get their work on values that we agree with and share into the world at large. And so we have 16, maybe 17 now fellows that are part of the Demos family, extended family, and we're delighted to have that. The second issue, the second area of expansion is into the international arena. There's no question, and I think that no one has made this case more eloquently than Ben Barber, that no country is an island. Certainly not the United States. We live in a global world. We live in a place where communication is internationalized, where capital is internationalized, where consumer norms are internationalized, where advertising is internationalized, where McDonald's is internationalized. And so we need to have a culture and we need to have a politics in this country that understands how we can go forward in a benevolently interdependent way rather than a malevolently interdependent way. So for all of those reasons, I thought one of the most kind of serendipitous joinings was between Demos and Professor Ben Barber. As of January 1st, Professor Barber became a distinguished senior fellow at Demos, and he brought really two things that I thought really worked for us. One is a significant body of work in globalization and international issues, which I think allows us to move into those areas and I think add something to the public debate that is essential. But secondly, has been one of the deepest thinkers and writers on the issue of democracy and how a democracy ought to function, what genuine civic engagement is, what real participation ought to be like in deep democracy and strong democracy. And so you have in Ben Barber somebody who thinks both deeply and writes eloquently on international issues and is concerned with our democracy as well. So he's best known, of course, for his work Jihad versus McWorld, but he has been a distinguished professor in many, many places around the country. In Rutgers, currently finishing his term as the University of Maryland, but most importantly, from our point of view, now a distinguished senior fellow at Demos. And Consumed, the book that Ben's going to be talking about tonight, is in some ways a sequel to Jihad versus McWorld because it really describes, critiques, talks about, understands, and gives us a little bit of an antidote to the global consumer culture, which is, I think, damaging us all. So we're delighted to have Ben as part of the Demos family. We're delighted to have the launch tonight of Consumed, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Barber, Distinguished Demos Senior Fellow.
Thanks so much, Miles. I've been teaching and in universities for about 40 years, but I have to admit that this is the first home in which I've really felt comfortable in 40 years. The university, as you know, is a very ambiguous place, and we go there looking for ideas, intellectual exchange, and scholarship, but increasingly we find a reflection of the commercial society we live in which career and commerce are far more important than ideas or ethics. So it's really a delight for me at this stage of my life to be part of this extraordinary organization, which for the last 7 years has now become part of the American and increasingly global landscape in terms of not just issues, seemingly soft issues like civil society and citizenship and democracy, but very hard issues like the abuse of credit, the rights of ex-felons, and the role of money in voting. Hard, tough issues that Demos has been dealing with both as theory and practice. This is just one book, my recent book, Consumed, that I'm going to talk about today, but on your way out, have a look. You'll see on the right there's 6 or 7 or 8 other books that have been published over the last several years coming out of research and other projects that Demos has sponsored, which address many of the issues that I try to synthesize here. And indeed, if you look at my bibliography, you'll see that well before I was associated with Demos, I was relying on books and literature that came out of this organization. So I'm really very grateful to be working with Miles and with his colleagues here, and I'm delighted that we are doing this meeting this evening on Consumed. I've talked about it in many different places since it appeared last month. This will probably be a little less lively than the Colbert Report, where I started talking about it, and there are fewer people than Tavis Smiley reached when I talked with him a couple of weeks ago. But this is exactly the right audience, I think, for this book, and I'm delighted that we can talk about it together this evening. We are joined, we have a public access television channel here that Joe is broadcasting. You should know that you will be recorded and your comments will be on public access television. That's not an invitation to act up, however, just to let you know. Capitalism, I believe, is a system which in its origins did many things very well. We know the things, particularly among groups and individuals that we represent here. We know the problems of capitalism. We know that it serves equality badly. It doesn't concern itself particularly with jobs. It has a lot of problems. But it was an extraordinary recipe in the 15th and 16th, 17th century, and here in the United States in its Puritan Protestant manifestations in the 18th and 19th century. It was an extraordinary recipe for linking together self-interest and altruism, because the promise it made was that if you were willing to invest in products and services that addressed core human needs and core human wants, you would both respond to those wants, increase the productivity and bounty of society, and make a profit. And that was that linking together of, in effect, selfishness, narcissism on the one hand, but service to society on the other. And as a result, we know Max Weber memorialized this. Early capitalism struck an extraordinary alliance with the rise of Protestantism. And Max Weber's great volume, written 100 years ago last year, called the spirit of the rise of capitalism and the spirit of the Protestant ethic. That book put together the Protestant ethic with capitalism and showed that the virtues that early Protestants, and in this country early Puritans, called on, virtues of saving, deferred gratification, the celebration of hard work, and service to others, the moral virtues of early Protestantism, were precisely virtues that also served early capitalism, which was about deferring gratification, waiting to take your product, celebrating work and hard work in the service of others, knowing, however, that you too would be rewarded both here on earth with earthly rewards and later on as well. That formula generated extraordinary productivity and growth, first in Europe and then in the United States. We also know, that's not my theme tonight, that it generated extraordinary injustices, extraordinary inequalities. It generated imperialism. It generated human exploitation. So next to its many virtues, there were many vices. But it did have those virtues, and to some extent well into our current epoch, retained those virtues. Wealth production, answering real needs, and generating among those who were concerned with themselves as well as others a motive for serving others, namely the profit incentive. Now, the argument of this book is that that form of capitalism is vanishing today as a consequence not of capitalism's failure, but capitalism's success. Success in the sense that in the developed world, or in the developed parts of the developed world, because we know there are pockets of third world poverty and injustice in the first world, in every American city and every European city, but in those parts of the world where the middle class is a majority, which is a lot of the developed world, core needs and wants have largely been addressed and responded to. Capitalism has produced sufficient wealth, and democratic states have managed to distribute that wealth sufficiently, in a sufficiently egalitarian manner, to assure that most of the majority have most of what they need, which leaves capitalism in a peculiar position because it has to continue to produce goods and services to make money, but increasingly those with wealth don't have needs in any core sense. And that has meant that in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, capitalism has made a remarkable shift from producing goods and services to meet real needs to manufacturing needs to sell all the products that it continues to have to produce and sell in order to stay in business, which is why the chief industry of our new epoch of capitalism is marketing, advertising, the selling of goods that can't be considered necessary or in many ways even wanted. This isn't a fancy argument. This isn't an argument that what people want, what is it that people want, who am I to say what they want? What I'm saying is that capitalism has been so good at producing what we need and want, and I don't just mean shelter, food, and clothing. We're talking about transportation, we're talking about television sets, we're talking about kitchens, we're talking about homes. The majority of Americans are homeowners. The fact is, capitalism has produced a lot of what the middle class needs, but has to go on producing and persuading people to buy it. And that means it must now increasingly increase the pool of consumers, expand the compass of shopping, begin to market not just adults, but also to children, and begin to try to persuade adults that they ought to shop not just some of the time, but all of the time, and shop for things that they don't really need. Which is to say, increasingly, markets today corrupt children by targeting them, dumb down adults by trying to give them childish, impetuous tastes so that they behave like children and buy the world of market goods, including movies and fast food and video games and gadgets that are designed for primarily teenagers, but now sold to people everywhere. And on the way to doing that, has swallowed citizens whole, by which I mean, and this comes back to a primary theme here at Demos, the public sector has been liquidated. Privacy and private behavior, private consumption is seen as more significant and important to liberty than public consumption, public goods, public purposes. So privatization has also been part of this transformation, in which today there are many who see consumers as the surrogate for citizens and private consumer choice as a perfectly legitimate substitute for civic choice, for citizen choice, for public choice. Now, that fundamental change in capitalism, as I'm suggesting here, has not only been terrible for democracy, terrible for our concept of public goods, it's also been bad for capitalism as well, and has not served capitalism well, because capitalism is basically in a position today where it's on a race to sell us more and more stuff when in fact we need less and less. Now, I've bracketed that part of the world that isn't middle class, and of course that's the majority of the world. You might be saying, well, this is all about just the privileged classes of the developed world. What about the rest of the world? Well, that's the other half of where capitalism has gone wrong. Because here's the problem. Those who have wealth, those who have earned income, have few real needs. Those who have desperate needs, 2/3 of the world's people, have no wealth. So those with needs can't be in the marketplace because they haven't got the wealth, and those with the wealth don't really need or want to be in the marketplace because most of their needs are satisfied. At least they don't have to be there to the degree the markets need them to be there in order to continue to do well. So what we see increasingly is a capitalism busy manufacturing needs and wants in the wealthy part of the world and ignoring and slighting the fundamental needs that are elsewhere, because those with those needs are in no position to buy things, to consume things. And that creates this fundamental anomaly of a capitalism trying to make its profits from those who have wealth but no needs, and ignoring the fundamental needs of those who could actually rekindle the real spirit of capitalism and put capitalism back into the business of answering real needs, except they're not players because they have no income, they have no wealth. That's the fundamental dilemma. Now, let me talk a little more concretely about what I mean when I'm talking about manufacturing needs, manufacturing wants, marketing, and then I'll talk a little bit also about the targeting of children and the dumbing down of adults, and end up talking a little about public and private liberty and maybe how capitalism can come back to beginning to address real human needs. But I know a lot of people, when I say manufacturing needs, say, what's a manufacturing need? What are you talking about? I mean, sure, people want things that you don't want because you're some elitist New Yorker. But most Americans like what they get. Indeed, the first thing that the commercial guys will tell you is, we just give people what they want. We're just people. We don't make it up. They say what they want, and we say, here you go. I want to suggest to you that's simply not true. First of all, $250 billion a year is spent in marketing and advertising. Now, that's a lot of wasted money if people know what they want and all capitalism has to do is give it to them. So clearly, there's a lot. Now, you might say, well, but advertising is about providing information. People have to know what's out there. That's true, but we know that marketing does a lot more than that. Anyone here need an iPhone? There you go. See, there are at least 3 who do, and I think out there are about 3 million Americans who have said, oh my God, bring it on. But of course, they didn't know they needed an iPhone last fall. They only found out they needed an iPhone when Apple told them that they now had a phone that could not only take pictures and show movies, but download, like an iPod, from the internet and do iMessaging and email, and if you have a very small dog, I think walk your dog as well for you. But these are needs which are literally created, and a lot of people now want it. And when I've talked in some places, a number of people say, oh, I agree with everything you said about manufactured needs, except the iPhone. That's something I really need, they say. And we all have our favorite on that, but there are a lot of things much more obvious just in the gadgets and the video games that you can see are kind of pushed on people, and maybe they need them, maybe they don't. Let me start by talking about, actually, let's talk about this. Because, now, we are lucky. We live in a country where through public expenditure and the building out of aquifers and so forth, we live in a country where, in fact, we can get clean water from every tap in the country, and rich and poor alike have access to clean water, right? And yet, so many of us, here I am, up here, drink bottled boutique water. You know how much we spend a year on this water? $20 billion a year on bottled water we spend. There is no way anyone can indicate for me there is a need or even a want for this. This is the big cola companies and so on that have figured out that aside from selling colas, if they can go up to Maine or over to Michigan or down to Texas and buy the rights to get water from those communities, they can fill their bottles with exactly the same water that people in those communities get from their tap and sell it to us at $2 a shot. And the generous ones like Ethos water, you know Ethos, which Starbucks says, oh, we're terrific. We're going to give 5 cents of every $2 you spend to go to water projects in Africa. So buy our water, they say. You know how this gets to you. This gets to you in trucks and planes and trains that use fossil fuels. So in fact, here the shipment of water is using fossil fuels. The water you get through the taps comes without the use of fossil fuels. It's sold to you in bottles which are made of plastic, and although it's recyclable, if you recycle it, if you don't, it's going to take about 2,000 years for this stuff to disappear from the landfills and the places where you throw it out the side of your car when you're driving. So this is a noxious product for which there is no conceivable human need or even want that has been thrust on Americans, and through advertising, through marketing. It's kind of cool to do water, and there are some people said, yeah, but it's so easy to have this. My wife and I have talked about an idea. Let's all get one bottle, buy it once, and from then on, fill it from the tap. Then you can always have the water with you when you go. And every time you fill it from the tap, take the whole $2, not 5 cents from Ethos, the whole $2, and send it to your favorite third world water charity. You know, if that's what you want to do. That would be a way we could both stop the absurdity of this, but of course we know that's not going to happen. We know that the industry, the cola industries, are deeply involved in this. And we can replicate this in just about every field. Take pharmaceuticals. We know that in the third world, and the Bill Clinton Foundation was just responsible for, that's a much better thing to drink, by the way. We know that Bill Clinton has just been involved in helping to fund less expensive retrovirals. In the third world, retrovirals are very useful with people who are infected with AIDS, with HIV. And the fact is it's very, very hard to get them at a reasonable price in the third world. But the pharmaceuticals make far more money in the first world out of doing one of two or three different things. One is to sell poisons that you can inject in your face to look young, because it's a youth culture and youth is being sold. So buy some Botox and stick it in your face and freeze your face, and you can look at least 10 years younger, maybe even 20, though you sort of talk like this because your lips won't move at all once you got the injection in there. Botox is a manufactured need, a manufactured one, a rather dangerous one, and it's part of a whole marketing thing about marketing to youth that serves a lot else. But you don't just have to go there. Look in the Times this morning on the front page. Do you remember the main article there about the medicalization of teenager conditions with which then pharmaceutical companies are selling them toxic drugs meant for much worse psychotropic conditions, but being sold to unsuspecting parents by doctors being literally paid by the pharmaceutical companies. Now tell me that's about a genuine need or a genuine want. Yet that is not atypical. That is typical of how markets operate today. In a way, I feel bad for these guys because they're saying, hey, we've always done, what are you talking about? This is what we have to do to stay in business. Why are you on our case? That's the way it works. It's like with Imus a couple of weeks ago. Imus was doing for 30 years and being well paid to do for 30 years what he was fired for when he went just a little bit over the edge. Not really over the edge, because he'd been doing over the edge for the last 30 years. He was paid to be a shock jock. He was called a shock jock. And then, like the guy in Casablanca, oh, shocking, did you hear what Imus said? How shocking we are. Well, of course we're shocked. That's the whole point of these guys. They're being paid to shock us. They're being paid to create an audience for this kind of stuff. And it's the same audience, by the way, that right-wing radio and Hannity and all these guys talk up in a divisive rhetoric that's destructive to American politics. But it's all part of the necessary purposes of a capitalism that has to market this stuff, medicalize conditions, and sell us medicines we really don't need and in many cases are dangerous in order to survive. What I'm trying to say, I'm not making the old-fashioned argument that these are villains and thieves and just greedy people. I'm saying capitalism's got to go on making a living, and because it refuses and is unable to meet all of the real needs that are still out there, increasingly it finds itself in the position of selling us things we don't need, things that are bad for us. It used to be cigarettes with Joe Camel, now it's beer, and all those clever little advertisements, with the animals and so on, we know are geared basically to teenagers who aren't supposed to be drinking at all. Beer advertising, and you can talk to anybody in the industry, beer advertising is geared to sell beer to 15, 16, 17, or 18-year-olds who aren't supposed to drink. And that's why the advertisements are kind of silly, but we say, well, kind of clever, but clever in the manner that 17-year-olds are clever. Because that's their target audience. This also speaks to the way in which, if you are going to sell goods to people who don't really need or want them, you've got to try to turn them into consumers who look like the ideal consumer, the 15-year-old girl or the 14-year-old boy. Ideally a product that appeals to both, like Titanic, that has action and a sinking and so on, but a romance at the same time. The top grossing films of 2004, and you can go back to 2002 or up to 2006 and you'll find it's the same, the top 4 grossing films in the world. And this is among all audiences, all demographics, not just kids, were Shrek 2, Spider-Man 2, the animated The Incredibles, and the latest Harry Potter film of that year. We know Spider-Man 3 was just released 2 or 3 weeks ago. If any of you read the reviews, it got universally dreadful reviews, a total piece of junk, not even entertaining in the fashion that those kinds of blockbusters are supposed to be entertaining, and it's already broken all records for films around the world. And of course, those films also sell everywhere, because that's the other secret. you've got to sell globally for capitalism to do well, which means you have to dumb down not just Americans, but dumb down or appeal to dumb down taste everywhere, which is what the American industry does. And the poor French have such a hard time. They're protecting their cultural industry and their film industry like it was corn or potatoes or rice. You know, they treat it like a vegetable, and they try to subsidize it, but they don't realize that Americans have figured out how to sell a universal product, which is teen blockbuster films. And the French will never be able to compete with that, and they'll never be able to protect their industry against that. And that becomes a feature. So you need not just people who shop, but who will buy stuff they don't need. The fast food industry is geared to teenage eating. You don't sit down, you don't treat food as a social ritual, you eat on the run, you fuel up. Every mall in America has not restaurants, but food courts, where people scarcely sit down. You get a variety of fare, but the idea is fuel up and keep shopping. A 3-hour restaurant in a mall, that's 3 hours you're not shopping. And the idea is to make you available with renewed energy to shop. That's what fast food is about, and that's why it's being marketed all through the world. Same thing with athletic clothes, and so that's also about the culture of youth. Athletic shoes, 75 to 78% of the world's shoes manufactured today are athletic shoes. To my knowledge, 78% of the world's population aren't athletes up until now. But of course, now you buy an athletic shoe to sit in front of your TV and watch basketball, not actually to play basketball, and you feel kind of cool. And if you're wearing a Nike, well, then you're cool, and you don't have to be an athlete, but you've got the Nike brand. And increasingly, as a result, we're even seeing that people begin to identify with the brands that they wear rather than who they are. A couple of years ago, there's a striking image I saw in the paper of a kid wearing a yarmulke in New York, and he had embroidered on top of the yarmulke the Nike swoosh, kind of trumping his Jewish identity with his real branded identity. Nike becomes not just something you buy to wear, but what you wear becomes who you are. Anyone remember who won, the 3 leading men who won the marathon last fall in New York, the 2 leading women, where they came from? Which countries? One of them, right, good, that's very good. I only remember one thing. There was only one winner. All 5 came from that winner. It was Nike. All 5 of them had the same Nike outfit on, top to bottom, the swoosh, everything. They had basically been sponsored by that, so that Nike won 5 times the New York Marathon. And it's nice you remember there was a Kenyan there, and that's great, but it's for most of us, for most of it's hard to remember that. It's easy to see Cameroon. We are what we buy in this new, or as the cover of the American Conservative magazine has on it, I buy, therefore I am. I shop, therefore I am. And I'm happy to tell you that cover is there because a piece of my book is in the magazine, The American Conservative. I'm a progressive, I'm a left guy. But the fact is, a lot of people on the right, particularly on the Christian right, are deeply disturbed about this same materialism, this same branding that we're disturbed on the other side. And by the way, I think it's an area of potential political communion between the two sides. I think it's a place where so-called old left and right might find that they have a common enemy in a kind of pervasive universal marketing, and the notion that we are what we buy, what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, not what we believe, how we act as a citizen, the religion we practice, or the other more conventional forms of identity. The other thing that's happened with the new market capitalism is that if you are going to have capitalism survive under these difficult new circumstances, you need people to shop, not just some, but you need everyone to shop all the time. And the pervasiveness of the commercial culture, the way in which it fills up our virtual spaces, our real spaces, the signage around our city, the way in which it penetrates inside of educational institutions, the way in which even religious organizations become televangelical and begin to sell themselves like products, the way in which our politics is subordinated to money. The politicians who once were supposed to regulate and control money are now themselves the product of the very money they're supposed to be controlling. That's all been inverted. And you get what I call consumed a kind of commercial totalitarianism. And some people said, how dare you use that word? But think about it for a minute. If everywhere you went, you saw the crucifix or the Star of David, and every sign you saw a message, love Jesus or worship Muhammad. And that's all you saw. And if you went into schools and saw the same signage, and you turned on your television and all you saw was religious dogma thrown at you, at some point you'd say, gee, we live in a theocracy, and that's bad. Theocracy is a word we Americans don't like. Or imagine a world in which everywhere you went, you saw signs that said, support the leader, go with your president, Bush is good, Bush is God, or Clinton is God. No matter which side of the spectrum you're on. Imagine every sign is political, every advertisement is political. That's the way it was in the Soviet Union, right? Anyone who was there in the 70s and 80s knew all the signage was about the party and about the state and about the leader and the Supreme Soviet. And what did we call that? We called that a totalitarian society because it obliterated the party and politics. Even if you thought they were doing good, they still said, but you can't have it obliterate and dominate everything. That's totalitarianism. But we live in a society in which the commercial, and exclusively the commercial, dominate nearly every message, every signboard, every television show, every movie, everywhere you look. In the schools, Channel 1 now is in 12,000 American high schools showing advertising in the classroom. Students are watching advertising because that's the deal poor principals have made. Say, well, lease us some of the television equipment we can use, and we'll give you our students to watch advertising during class. It's everywhere. And what do we call that? We call that freedom. Not theocracy, not totalitarianism. We call that freedom. We call that choice. And I would argue that what is dangerous is not that commerce is a part of things. It should be a part of things. It's when it becomes everything and obliterates everything else. I grew up partly in New York and partly up in western Massachusetts, and there were a bunch of small towns there like Pittsfield and Great Barrington. If you went into Pittsfield, a town like Pittsfield in the 1950s, and you probably went into any town in America, what did you see? There'd be a church spire, there'd be a school, there'd be a town hall, there'd be a small art museum, there'd be some shops, there'd be a larger store, there'd be a post office. There'd be a town that represented the full diversity and pluralism of human life, that represented our diverse character as human beings. And our landscape should do that. It should represent the diversity of who we are. But today, if you live in the suburbs, if you lived out in Piscataway, where my wife and I lived for 15 years, and you came out and said, let's go downtown, let's go to that Park Square, I wouldn't know where to take you. Because there was nothing but one strip mall, one large box mall after the other. There were literally no towns. And every space was dominated by buying and selling and commerce. And nearly everything else had disappeared. 55% of Americans live in suburbia. And in suburbia, it's hard to find anything but malls and multiplex. Occasionally you find a little church sitting out somewhere, a little town hall somewhere next to the police station, but separated from everything else. You got to go by car, no no foot traffic. Can't even have bicycles and ride around and create a community because in most of American suburbia today there are no sidewalks. Because biking, you can't shop while you're biking or walking. But you get in your car and you go through the drive-in, you go to the mall, and you shop. So this is, I believe this permeation of American culture by commerce is a deep distortion of what it is to live in a democratic, multiple, heterogeneous society. That yes, has room for shopping and production and buying and selling and advertising as one part. We can argue about whether it should be 10% or 20%. But most would agree after a third it's getting a lot, and when it's a half it's too much, and when it's all there is, that's a disaster. Even for those who are engaged in making a living off of them. And one of the interesting things about our society is that people in marketing and advertising and in industry today often are appalled by the society that they've helped to create and don't want their kids to, grow up in it, and try to find ways to close their kids off from the commercial television, the commercial internet, the commercial web and so on, the commercial games and the violent games that they help to produce. Which brings me to this issue I started to talk about in the beginning of private and public liberty. Because again, a lot of people will say, yeah, but you just don't like freedom. You pretend to be a Democrat, you don't like freedom. This is what people want. And all we're doing, if they want the mall, they want all those shops, and so that's what they want. If they wanted something else, they wouldn't go to the mall. We just give people what they want. Here's the problem with that. Yes, commerce provides us with what we want as private consumers. It both creates but also meets private desires. But there is a fundamental difference between what we want and wish for and will as private consumers and what we want and wish for and will as public citizens. And all of us know the difference. I'm an old-fashioned sort of, would-be macho guy, and when I drive, man, I would love to drive a big, powerful, BMW. Lots of horsepower, and bigger the better, and maybe even I'd like to have a Hummer. You can run everybody else off the road, feel completely safe, and so it gets 8 miles to the gallon, 6 miles to the gallon. So it's a monster. As a private consumer, that's not my concern. But of course, as a public citizen, I say, wait a minute, I don't want a world in which anyone, including me, is driving Hummers and using all that oil and running other people off the road and driving a car that's much higher than any other car. So when you run into somebody, you go right through their windshields and kill everybody in their car, even though you come out safe. So as a citizen, I might say, let's have regulations that tax such cars high, that give incentives in order to create cars that don't use gas that same way. As a citizen, in other words, I contradict and even veto some of the private choices I make. Am I unfree when I do that? On the contrary, I am more free. And the public choices are important, because here's the other side of that. There are social consequences to private choosing that as private choosers we're usually not aware of and don't think about. And we can only deal with them as public citizens. I'll give you a couple of examples. You go to LA, you can buy any one of 200 automobiles. You can rent at Hertz. They have even groups now of, special cars, of adventure cars and family cars and sports cars and so forth. Any kind of car you want, you can get. You have a world of private choice. But if you decide, you know what, thank you very much, I'll just take the subway or I'll take a bus. You don't have that choice, because there is no usable public transportation in LA, and no amount of multiplication of private choices of brands of cars is going to get it. A public transportation system has to be the choice of public citizens thinking together, working together, and trying to figure out what kind of a world they want to live in. Moreover, when Americans buy, as they've been doing for a long time, half of the cars sold in America on truck bodies or SUV bodies, gas guzzlers. When you buy that car, you don't will the Iraq War into existence, do you? But in fact, the consequence of America utilizing gas-guzzling cars has been oil dependency. And oil dependency has led America to mix in places and in ways we might otherwise as citizens not wish to see. The war in Iraq, to the extent it's about oil, it's about other things too, I know, but to the extent it's about oil, is the direct result of our private choices as consumers. The unthought public consequences of oil dependency and mixing in with the world. I'll give you another example that may appeal to those of you who think about poor people and the choices they make. I understand that poor people like Walmarts, and they like Walmart for a good reason. They can get a larger variety of goods at a cheaper price than they'll get from any mom and pop store or any retail store in the old towns and cities where they grew up. It's a good deal for them. It's not a good deal for them to be working there. That's another matter. We can get into unionization and wages and health plans and so on. That's a whole other thing. But in terms of the consumer, Walmart's not a bad thing. But when consumers who are poor shop at Walmart's, they don't think about the fact that in supporting Walmart's, they are willing the destruction of retail in their downtown communities and in their inner cities. And the mom and pop stores can't survive, and the small retail stores can't survive because they have higher prices and less variety of goods. They can't survive. And so in effect, when you shop at Walmart, you make a private choice to get good variety and a cheap price, and without realizing it, you make a public choice, an invisible public choice, to destroy the communities of America, which are the basis of the social fabric of family values and communities in the neighborhood. But we don't think about that. We don't realize that. And we don't think about translating those social costs into an economic cost. If you translated the cost of destroying our downtowns and added a percentage of that to everything you buy at Walmart, Walmart would be 4 times or 5 times higher in price than anything you buy at the mom and pop store. But we don't reckon social consequences into private consumer purchases. So our accounting's all screwed up. It renders the public consequences of our private choices invisible. We think we don't have to pay for them, just like oil dependency. The war in Iraq so far is what? 90 billion, 160 billion, depending on how you reckon it, dollars. Add that to the price of the cars, the cheap gas guzzlers Americans have been buying for the last 60 years, and those cars get awfully expensive. But of course, we don't reckon it that way. Those are separate. In fact, those say, oh, the state's too big, it's wasting all that money, it's spending all that money. So in fact, where we have the real power, the real liberty to choose the character of our public lives and the public environment comes only from what we can do as citizens, not what we can do as consumers. So while it's true maybe you get some choice, some private choice to consume certain things, the real question is not what you can buy from the cafeteria of choices, but who makes the menu. Real power is who makes the menu, who makes the agenda. And it's as citizens that we gain power over the agenda, over the menu, over the realm of choices. It's as citizens that we say, let's also build adequate, fast, efficient, and cheap public transportation in LA so you don't have to sit for 10 hours on the freeway every day to get to work. And so that poor people can also get easily to work in an efficient and safe and quick way, which is, by the way, what they did in New York, 100 years ago, which is why New York and towns like it have reasonable public transportation, and which is why, in fact, we know, all of us know, that if you want to go somewhere in New York, you take the subway, you don't take your car, because it's faster. It actually works. That was a public choice. But if we lived in a city today like Phoenix without public transportation, that public choice of getting public transportation won't be made, which means Phoenix is going to end up like LA. More and more cars, more and more highways, more and more freeways, more and more traffic, more and more smog, less and less genuine choice, and even the joy of owning your own car becomes hellish because it can't take you anywhere. You just sit in it in permanent traffic jams. So in fact, the choice yielded by our private choices is narrowed. It narrows the real freedom we have. It doesn't widen the freedom, although it appears to widen it. A while ago, there was a place that sold only baked potatoes, but it had baked potatoes with bacon on top, cottage cheese on top, honey on top, salt and pepper on top, and it said, our company, our fast food potato company gives you freedom. It gives you the freedom to choose your toppings. So much of what is commercial and market freedom in America is about choosing the toppings. Which toothpaste, which kind of car, but not the fundamental freedom of shaping our public lives in ways that create an environment we want our kids to live in and our spouses to live in, and that even we ourselves are happy living in. For that, we need public choice. Public choice is yielded by our identity as citizens. And this is the last point I want to make. That's why the real question is, what has happened to the partnership between capitalism and democracy, and the right of citizens ultimately to trump the choices of consumers? And I don't mean citizens over here trump consumers here. I mean the citizen in us trumps the consumer in us. The citizen in us takes precedence because we will it so over the consumer in us. So I'll say, yeah, I want this and that, but that's bad for my kids and bad for my family and bad for me. So in fact, as a citizen, I will a quite different scenario. In that sense, the last 30 or 40 years since Reagan-Thatcher of privatization and blaming government as the problem and the public sector as the problem has been a systematic disempowerment of citizens. Self-willed. we have in effect willed our own disempowerment. We have allowed ourselves to be talked out of our common power, our civic power, by people saying, oh, government's the problem. You know, government, it over there. But it's not it, it's us. Democracy is us, not them. It's not about the president, it's about us. But we've been talked into thinking, no, let the market do it. That's where you exist as a free man and a free woman, in the marketplace, not in civic space, not in the democratic sector. So part of what this is about is reclaiming our power as citizens, re-empowering ourselves as citizens, so that we can then determine which private choices, which forms of consumerism are tolerable and which kinds aren't, and what goes and what doesn't go. I mean, we're the only country in the world that allows 4-year-olds and 2-year-olds to be targeted by advertisers. There's a new channel called Baby First that aims at 6-month-old infants. Psychologists have discovered that kids can recognize logos before they recognize words. And the brand marketers have said, all right, you know, let's go with that. Let's go after them then. Let's start getting brands on TV to kids when they're toddlers, infants, when they're 6, 7, 8 months old. That should be what, as citizens, we regulate. We can say that's very nice, but we will not permit that. There was a time when parents were gatekeepers for their children. They stood in the way. They blocked access to their children. Marketers know that. I've been to marketing conferences with titles like Getting Rid of the Gatekeepers, meaning getting parents out of the way so we can get at the kids. Look at the way malls are set up. The stores for kids and teens are in one section, and for the grown-ups are way in another section. The hope is divide up the families. Families that shop together spend far less than families that divide up into their demographic, because particularly the kids go and spend a whole lot of stuff. And of course, kids increasingly have sway over the discretionary spending of their parents to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. So you want both to get the gatekeepers out of the way or put the kids in control of the gatekeepers' wallets, which is even better. That is a world that is simply unacceptable, but it is not a world we can solve directly through marketing. We have to solve that through our citizenship. Last point, capitalism itself, though it needs the oversight and regulation of democracy, it's always worked best in partnership with democracy, can also do things a little differently. It can begin to figure out how to address the real needs of the world. I talked about water, for example. Entrepreneurial capitalism needs to think about how it can help people in the third world themselves start little companies that manufacture, for example, from the clay under people's feet in Africa, rain cisterns and clay filters to filter the water. A clever guy has invented a little hand pump with an 8-9 foot pipe you put into the ground, and the hand pump allows you to pump clean water from the water table, 8 feet, 9 feet down. That could be the basis for a village industry. It could also provide clean water for people. It could jumpstart an entrepreneurial attitude in those places, which capitalists ought to be happy. I mean, there's nothing wrong with folks wanting to make some money on the way to addressing real needs, but then go where the needs are. But to do that, you have to defer taking your profit, which is what the early guys did. John Rockefeller even the big moguls, they actually lived relatively austere lives. They put it all back in. They reinvested it all. They waited to take their profits. Today, it's all about taking the profits, the quarterly profit sheets, the stock market, the stakeholders. They want it now. Nobody wants to wait around. The trouble if you say to people, why don't you go to the third world and figure out how to do mosquito nets locally so people can use them to stop getting malaria and so on, they'll say there's not enough profit in that. You only get 5 or 6% in that. If I do Botox, man, I can get 100, 200% profit in a very short time. So capitalists have to go back, if you like, to that aspect of the Protestant ethic that says, we'll make a profit, but we'll serve. And we'll serve by waiting to take our profit. And we'll help other people get involved, because when they do, then the size of the market will increase, and capitalism will be in a position once again to, at least for the next couple hundred years, serve real needs in those parts of the world that haven't yet begun to develop. Take the world of alternative energy. There's a young man here today trying to figure out how to create a smaller footprint, a carbon footprint, a footprint in the world in which After all, any kind of development in capitalism means that we take up environmental space. Well, there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity around figuring out how to narrow our carbon footprint, how to get alternative energy that doesn't rely on fossil fuel directly or indirectly, as some of the alternative energy schemes actually depend indirectly on fossil fuel. So how do you do that? Clinton for a while was making a very good case, and Al Gore more recently has made the case that in fact there's a lot of entrepreneurial work to be done and probably money to be made for the person who figures out how to get a smaller carbon footprint for each person, particularly in developed societies. We already know that your carbon footprint is not well correlated with your quality of life. The 12 countries with quality of life indices higher than the United States, there are 12 of them, and some people would say even 18, depending on how you measure it, they all use about half of the carbon that we do. So there's no necessary correlation between the size of your carbon footprint and the quality of life. Well, that's, again, for an entrepreneur, for a capitalist of the old sort, oh, that's great. I'm going to invent some stuff that will help us do that and make some dough along the way and serve, my country and my people at the same time. So capitalism can also take steps in that direction. But finally, it won't happen without the partnership with democracy. And to me, the core problem comes back to the political problem. The dissolution of that crucial partnership between democracy and capitalism, between citizens and consumers, and the relationship that understands capitalism is there to serve citizens, not the other way around. Markets are there to serve democracy, not the other way around. Money is there to help create a more human life, not the other way around. And when we restore that balance and get back to that, then we see also the necessity for a changed politics. And it's not just, as I say, left and right, because I want to recall that the American conservative, Pat Buchanan, he's got a lot of problems with Pat Buchanan, but he understands that corporate capitalism is not good for America, is not good for ethics, is not good for what we want. A lot of people on the left think that too. So I think there is a way out of the difficult dilemmas that are raised in this book, and they entail both restoring capitalism to its proper role and also restoring the balance between democracy and the marketplace. And if we can do those two things, I think we can turn it around and create a society that is as pluralistic and diverse as human aspirations. Thank you.
I appreciate your talk because in my subconscious, I think I've always realized the problem you've spoke on, but I've never really reflected on it. But I see a huge problem I wish you would talk about, and that has to do with human nature. And I see human nature as extremely powerful. We've evolved, and we've been able to control part of our human instinct, but we're still very vulnerable to it. And it seems like when you talk about the public and private sectors, you're talking about two things that just the private sector is relying on selfishness, whereas the public sector is a communal conscience almost, and it's just the power. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do. No, I think you're implying that the selfish tends to trump in human nature the altruistic and the communal. And let me say, though, that I think that polarization is a little bit of a mischaracterization of the reality, because in fact, civicness, communityness, participation in a larger community is not about altruism. When you get, the circle of community grows beyond the me. We all start out as little infantile me's, and we remain that way until we're 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 or nowadays all the way through our life. But in fact, as we grow, you get married, and suddenly the me includes another person, and it's a we. It may just be you and your spouse, but the compass of your interests is, and you wouldn't just say, I want her to be happy, but that has nothing to do with my happiness. My happiness actually depends on her or him being happy. Then you have kids. And again, it's not that I'm not an altruist, I care more about my kids than myself. It's that who I am is invested in the happiness of my children. So the me now extends to the we of family, and then the extended family is the neighborhood. And you care about how the neighborhood looks and how people are healthy and safe in it, in part because if they're safe, you're safe, but in part because your interests now have grown to encompass their interests, and you feel genuine pain. And a genuine civic community at a state or even a national level is a community where I feel myself in a selfish way pain when others are poor or others suffer. And that's not just about altruism or being a nice person, but human nature is that we're selfish. It's about human nature being embedded in communities. And in fact, I think you'd find, in terms of very realistic human nature, that most of human happiness is derived from communities, whether it's the community of the family or the neighborhood, and not a whole lot of happiness in the most selfish way actually comes from just being a narcissistic, selfish individuals. Most of us know people who are very selfish, are isolated, narcissistic, alone, and very unhappy, which is why they often do desperate things and violent things and so on. So what I want to say to you is that it's not me against them, but then I'm going to be altruistic. It's the growing out of the me to include extended communities in which my own sense of myself and the interest of the community merge into one. And that's what happens in healthy communities. And that, I think, can happen in a healthy democracy. I think the polarization comes when people try to say, no, just do your own thing. Never mind anybody else. But I don't think that's in keeping with human nature. I think actually, there's been quite a lot of interesting research by psychologists and sociologists that does suggest that we are deeply embedded in communities, and our nature tends in that sense to be communal, and our happiness comes to tend to come out of that, not because we give ourselves up to and throw the self away and instead take on a collective identity, but because our own personal identity grows into and becomes part of a family and a neighborhood. So that that's the direction in which I think an answer lies. And I think personal happiness and personal gain come from membership in healthy communities, not from being alone and isolated and getting just what I want all the time. Yes, let's come up forward here. Would they use the microphone? Yeah, you first. I'm sorry, and then afterwards up here. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I just want to say that this is a very relevant question. I'm glad it was asked.
With you in your response, it's very important that we do give that kind of response. What came to mind was when you were speaking about the response to the claim that, hey, you know what, this is what people want, right? You spoke about community. You spoke about civics. I was thinking more specifically, is that the realm of ethics? Is that where your analysis, in its core, would be coming from? Is it an ethical argument? And it makes sense to me at that level. I was just wondering whether you could.
That's a good question. Some people differentiate between personal ethics, public morals, or political morals, and Machiavelli, of course, made such a distinction between it that he said, evil people can actually serve the community very well, and sometimes people who try to do good personally hurt the community, and we think of that as a kind of Machiavellian perspective. There is some difference clearly between what works as an individual and what works for a group. But again, my mentor here is Immanuel Kant or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who would argue that it's precisely when you generalize your personal ethic and think about how it applies across the board that you measure its real normative, its real ethical power. And Kant, I think, would argue that that distinction between a personal ethic and a public ethic isn't real, that is precisely the public character of an ethic that gives it its ethical character, which is why we feel when we're acting on behalf of our children with whom we identify, we're more ethical than we're acting just on behalf of ourselves, but we're acting on behalf of a whole neighborhood. Maybe we're even more ethical than just thinking selfishly about our children and so on. So that in that expanding realm of consciousness of the other is what I think constitutes, at least in the moral theory that I'm drawn to, that constitutes what it is to be moral. And in that sense, the moral and the civic converge. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the great champion of that view, that the moral and the civic goods converge. But it can be argued. There are people who argue individual ethics and public ethics are two different things. So we could have an argument about it. Up front here.
Thank you. I actually have two questions for you, Professor.
Talk right into the mic.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
just
have
like.
questions for you. The first
the selfish American, and whether or not you would speculate that there's been some very conscious marketing of the modern human nature as individual and selfish. I mean, the ego as such really doesn't develop until you get, say, Maupassant, you get Freud, you get, and even Jung, maybe later, that this is a modern phenomenon to even start thinking about selfishness in these terms. Certainly Smith and Kondiak didn't see it that way. So do you think there's been sort of a conscious brainwashing through marketing on some level that makes us think that human nature really is this?
Well, that's a great question, but let me break it just into two pieces, because what is certainly the is that Americans have a deep historical tradition of individualism, way before there was marketing. I mean, we are, a lot of people who came to America came to get away from oppressive collective societies, and that's where this distinction comes when you and I talked about it. We know that collective ethics can look oppressive, that religious and communal ethics can get in the way, and America has always been a place where kind of individualists come, and they come to do it, and we have a strong individualist tradition. We know about the gun lobby, and we know about Colorado and the West, and people going out and their farms and getting far away from everyone else. So there has been a strong individualistic tradition, and I don't want to condemn it. It's a fact. It's out there, and I think in many ways it's a source of American strength. That individualism and that unwillingness to be bullied around. My problem is in America that all the people who don't want to be bullied around by government in the states, the Montana militia and so forth, guys like that, and I even have a little sympathy for that. They're anarchists, they're libertarians, leave me alone, I'm there, let me do my own thing. Great, do your own thing. But then when it comes to the corporate marketplace, they don't recognize when they're being bullied, when they're being brainwashed, when they're being pushed around. They think the only source of authority and brute force is the state and state entities. So they're libertarians when it comes to the state, but they're slavish, adherers when it comes to the marketplace, where they don't even recognize that they're being bullied and pushed around and so forth. And the real fact of modernity, in the 18th century, the main place that power resided was either the church or the state. And if you were someone who cared about individual liberty and you wanted to push back power, you pushed back against the state. No question about it. The guys who founded our country figured that out, which is why they created a limited government with a Bill of Rights and a separation of powers and all that stuff. They were worried about state power, and they were right. But the difference 200 years later is that the primary locus of real power is no longer just government, but in the media, in corporations, in people who produce and manufacture things. And if we ignore that, then we don't see where the real power is coming from. So my problem isn't so much that Americans, have a strong strain of independent individualism, but that it's so one-sided and almost old-fashioned, and thinking that the only problem is abusive authority by the state rather than the abuse of authority by all these private market organizations. Or if I can put it this way, Tocqueville was the first one to remind us of this: abuse from the bottom, abuse from popular opinion, abuse that comes bottom up, not top down. We tend to think of authority and power as top down, and individuals say, I'm ready to take it on, but they don't notice it when it comes up from the bottom. So for me, that's a larger part of the problem. Individualism in and of its sense, it's okay, and there is both an individualistic and a communalist tradition in America that, are a little bit in combat with one another, but that kind of attention's okay. I think that's healthy for democracy. Yes, we'll come here and then to the gentleman here. Yes, the two of you, why don't you start?
How about me?
And then to you, sir.
I have a question about, I love your bottled water example, because
It's a great thing to use because, like you said, there's permeation all over of consumer choice and marketing to us, and a lot of people believe that tap water is actually unsafe to drink, right? And so that's why they drink bottled water. So even if it's tap water from someplace else. So how do you combat that? Like, how do we, because, if I just stop drinking bottled water, it's not going to make a difference, in a mass scale of a $20 billion industry.
Just two quick things. One is clearly roles that government should play is to provide accurate information about those things. And, government could be the first to say, that it's the same water in the bottles you get from your tap, first of all, and second of all, tap water is actually just fine. And by the way, now that they've added fluoride, as for children, for their teeth, you don't get that in bottled water. So people who feed their children actually bottled water don't get the fluoride that a long time ago most of us decided was a pretty, good idea in terms of teeth. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, how you deal. You can't just do it one-on-one, although consumer behavior does matter. You can use your consumer. I mean, if enough people stop buying this water and go to an alternative, they're going to have to, they're going to stop doing it because it's not going to bring them a profit. But the other thing is we have to do it as citizens. We have to do it through our citizenship. We have to do it through regulation. I don't mean bar them from selling the water, but the right kind of informational campaign help people realize that they're just throwing away their money here, and there's much, much better ways to do it. Yes, sir.
I take very little exception to what you said. I agree. However, I'm trying to put in place another movement that I feel is great, and that's the rise. And this may be my eternal optimism. It may be a naive approach, but I think there's a rise in social consciousness. I think that it accounts for and this may have been stimulated by business. There's a rise in the need for organic food and the ills of the mass agriculture and buying locally. Philanthropy, I think, is on the rise. It's become and maybe a very small segment, but I'm trying to put in place the two things. It's like two channels that are running. One is very huge, perhaps. The good will take over the evil, and I'd love you to address that.
Or I would just change the verb to can. The good can take over the evil. Will it?
Will depend. No, right. No, I'm just saying. Well, that will depend on us. I'm an optimist too, and I think, by the way, you're right. There's lots of signs in different ways, even among those who are most targeted as consumers, teenagers. You see a lot of kids looking for alternative forms of, the net, alternative forms of entertainment and music, kind of trying to reject the stuff being thrust on them by the push culture of the big corporations. So I think there's a lot of reason for hope. I mean, Al Gore's movie, the green consciousness of so many Americans, the fact that there's a young man here who's trying to, model what it would look like to narrow your footprint and, have a low impact rather than a high impact life. Things like that are all signs. So I think you're right. There's a lot there, but I think we also have to make it happen through political organization and political movement. We can't just because otherwise we're just trying to act as consumers to change an environment in which consumerism is too powerful. And we have to also act as citizens. Yes, sir.
I want to make a statement and ask a question about business history and
Yes.
capitalism. Actually, prior to Peter Drucker, the world of businessmen and entrepreneurs ran business. Peter Drucker popularized the idea of creating demand, suggesting that the job of the business is to make consumers believe that they had needs that they didn't realize. So that happened. What's happened now, where the situation, rather than leaving the marketers, we're now in a period of finance capitalism, where investment bankers and capitalists deciding what business should be operated. How are we going to, and I think that's responsible for the position that we're in right now. What do you think of all that?
Well, yes, certainly people like Peter Drucker and the people.
Back to Galbraith and others who were aware of the rise of marketing and the rise of advertising as powerful forces. And I think you're right that a capitalism that increasingly thinks it's about a parasitic expansion of wealth that's already there rather than the creation of wealth. I mean, whatever you think of capitalism, it did one thing brilliantly. It created wealth. It literally created wealth. And the real problem of the modern capitalism you and I are talking about is it doesn't create wealth anymore. It parasitically takes advantage of it. The whole acquisition and merger movement is trying to make money without actually producing anything new. That's also true of marketing and so forth and advertising. So yes, that is a problem. I do believe it's there, though, in the structure of capitalism. It's not because Peter Drucker or somebody else said that's what we need to do is create demand, but that capitalism, as it succeeded, understood how to do that. If you watch the movement in the 1920s and 30s, when people stopped talking about trademarks and in the 1930s started talking about brands, what you saw is a transformation from a capitalism in which there was a coal producer, an oil producer, a calico producer, a salt producer, and a sugar producer, to 10 salt producers and 10 sugar producers. And each of them then had to vie. So it wasn't just a trademark, I sell oil. If you want oil, you go to Standard Oil, and so on. It was all these different companies vying to sell the same thing. And initially they tried to sell it around quality and price. But in time, they began to say, well, be loyal to us, and we're a good company to do business with, and you'll feel good, and so forth, until you come today to somebody like Starbucks, the guy who runs Starbucks, who says, we're not in the coffee business, we're in the feeling business. The people who run the athletic companies and so on say they're in the affect business. There's a guy who used to be the head of Saatchi has written a book called Love Marks. He says we're beyond trademarks, we're beyond brands, it's now love marks. We got to get people to love their brands so much it doesn't matter whether they need or want the product. And the example he gives is very telling. He says, I have always used Head and Shoulders, and for the last 10 years I continue to use it, and I love it. And I know it's the perfect brand, he said, because I've been bald for 10 years. But that's ideal. Someone using a brand they don't need or want, but they're so loyal to, so it's all about. So yes, there's a fundamental transformation of the kind that you talk about, but for reasons that I think are built into the character of capitalist growth and development. Let's start here and go back this way. 1, 2, 3. Yes.
So you mentioned that these things are inherent in the structure of capitalism, and as such, I agree and think this
has been told before. You mentioned Galbraith, or there's also Dwight McDonald was making a critique in the 1950s that popular culture means consumers. We didn't play the piano anymore. We just put on the record player, infantilized adults.
That's Packard in the Persuaders.
So what I hear and find most interesting, that is new, I think, is two things, if I can bounce it back in. One is the level of inequality today means that, as you said, the reason they're not going to make those clay borehole pipes for the water industry, and they are going to make the cold spring water, is because there isn't profit, long or short-term profit, to be made in the things we would think from a collectivity would be satisfying real demand because of the inequality in world income. There's just, people can't buy them. That's why they're going to sell Botox and not retrovirals to poor Africans. So that's new. It was funny that you brought up the 1920s, because that was the last time we had these levels of inequality in the 1890s. And then the second thing, the sort of structural thing you're talking about, you didn't use this term, but you described externalities, what economists call externalities. When two parties to a contract, all parties that are affected by the transaction are not included in the contract. In other words, the public. Yeah, the public when you throw out the plastic bottle, the person whose windshield you smash through when you buy your Hummer. I mean, and do you think that there's actually a quantitative rise in the number of externalities? There's been incomplete contracts more lately than there was 70 years ago or 50 years ago. So what are the structural changes that you're talking about that are new?
The reason I do
economies are increasingly interdependent, and they penetrate each other, and because of modern communications and transportation, the impact of private choice is much greater than it used to be. So that where and how you bought a piece of calico or your pound of salt or butter in 1880 is very different in terms of its impact on the larger social environment where externalities are involved than when you buy a Hummer. When you buy a Hummer, you're affecting labor policies in Mexico and the United States where these things are being made. You're affecting safety standards. You're affecting oil dependency. So yes, the growing interdependence of the world means that the compass of externalities is far greater, and therefore individual choices have far greater social consequences than they once did. That are not being taken into account. So that is a structural change. I'm glad you pointed to what I try to do all the way through is to say this isn't just about villains and selfish people, that you have it built into the structure of economics. But here, to come back to the first part of your question is, how do you deal with these structural things? The whole point of capitalism from the beginning has been that whenever it's left to its own devices, it tends to disintegrate around its own contradictions. It's a very contradictory system for exactly these reasons. And the state has always stepped in, not to overrule capitalism, but to save it from itself. So the trade cycles and so forth, which created in part the Great Depression and so on, led to a major intervention in regulatory things. The growth after the Civil War, capitalism appears interested in competition, new products, entrepreneurship, but quickly creates a world of cartels and monopolies in which there is no competition, and only with Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and FDR do you get then the state stepping in not to take over but to insist on and enforce genuine entrepreneurial competition of a kind that was quashed by raw capitalism doing its own thing. So, which leads me to say that these same new contradictions that today appear different than the old ones, but with the same impact of making capitalism not work very well, will be redressed only by analogous governmental democratic interventions to try to deal with their consequences. Because otherwise you get things like globally this race to the bottom, for example, that is good for no one, including the capitalists. So good questions. I'm sorry I can't do a little more with them now, but let's continue back here because we'll try to stop in about. We have a few more minutes. I know people need to get home, but let's see who. Put your hand up if you. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll come over here and take those 3. So we'll take, and I'll try to be briefer than I've been, so we get a little more time for questions.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. It was just wonderful.
You talked about as though there was an antagonism between individual action and collective action. And I'm running an experiment which is largely about individual action. The experiment is how can I and my little family try to live in New York City.
Introduce yourself to people.
Okay. My name is Colin Bevan, and I'm running an experiment called No Impact Man. And the experiment is about trying to see how low an environmental impact my family can cause while living in the middle of New York City. And in part, the experiment is in response to my concern that the government is owned by corporations, and feeling that even as we start to see legislation dealing with the climate, that the corporations are helping to sponsor that legislation and therefore co-opting the agenda and making sure they have control of it. So, and also responding to the lady that said that if one of us stops drinking bottled water, it can't have an impact on the $20 billion industry. Actually, what I'm finding is that as I change my lifestyle and talk, not in terms of you should, but just talk about what I'm doing, the people around me, my friends, my family, people that I know are starting to change their behavior too. And one thing that strikes me is I'm also a progressive, but what if all progressives decided to start taking individual action to complement their collective action? And the reason why I think that that's important is I have a blog, and my blog is all about my individual action. I try to stay away from politics because I'm finding that I'm attracting a large number of Christian conservatives. Now, I think this whole thing is about changing minds. And if I have the opportunity to change their minds, I want to do it. And the reason why they're attracted to what I'm talking about is because of my politics and my life. And I'm not saying it's always been this way or that it will always be this way. It's just that for the duration of this experiment, I'm trying to make my politics and my life fall in line with each other. So I think that there's something in there about how we can change people's minds. And I wanted to ask you about that synergy between.
Well, thank you. Synergy is the right word. Of course, you're right.
That there are all sorts of things we can do as individuals and even as consumers in how we exercise our consumer choices that will affect our world. There was a powerful movement from the 30s to the 70s called civic consumerism that included the boycott of the grape growers who weren't using unionized labor and so on. And obviously, using boycotts and so on, we can, as consumers, in how we do our behavior, that's important. But as you say, there's not a tension between that. That should serve political and civic activity. They don't need to be in tension, but they do need to work together. And my only argument is that either one by itself is going to be insufficient. And right now, there's a fair amount of emphasis, as somebody over here said, on philanthropy, on individual civic consumerism, and so on. And I think we're underplaying a little bit the need for also a renewed democratic politics. You might feel, no, well, we need some strong exemplars of individual behavior, and I'm delighted that you're doing what you're doing. But as you say, there really is a synergy between both of those. And thanks very much for what you're doing, and I hope we'll all continue to follow. What is your blog, by the way? Tell us what your blog is.
It's at noimpactman.com.
Good, thank you.
And what's happened in this city is this whole consumer mentality has come into the public education system. So we are now consumers, and we are told that's our role as parents. Sometimes children are consumers, and sometimes they're the product, and we're the consumer. It's a very weird fit, but the point is they keep talking about choice. You get a choice of high schools, you get a choice of middle schools, you get choice. And it's actually tragic, because these kids are being broken up all the time. So I've just gone through the high school process, which is of course a choice. And but we don't really do the choosing, it's the schools that choose us. And these friendships are being broken apart because of where they're going. Anyway, so
my wife and I just went through that high school process with our daughter having exactly the same.
Oh,
It's developmentally the wrong thing to be doing to children.
It's tragic.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
But it's this whole language of choice.
Exactly.
And next week the principals of the city have to choose their support network. None of them want any of this stuff, but of course it's choice. Which, by the way, was one of the biggest part of what has happened in the governance of this city. It was one of the greatest disenfranchisements, in modern history, with the getting rid of the school boards. But in any event, what I find even more Orwellian and disturbing is the role of community so-called community-based organizations, and how organizations which purport to be nonprofit and community-based are really complicit, because they take such huge contracts from the government, particularly from the chancellor and the mayor, and then they have to defend those contracts and become even more complicitous. And I don't see how, when I or anybody acts in a civic capacity, I need that intermediary organization.
I won't try to elaborate on it, because I think the point you make is very clear. Only to say that ever since Tocqueville noticed that almost every modern tyranny has flown under the flag of choice and liberty. You remember the Nazi concentration camps had across the thing, Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free, on the way to the death camp. So that wherever you see people advertising their choice and their liberty, very often, we should be suspicious. This is a case study. Can you be?
I've described myself as a socialist somewhat to the right of Ronald
Margaret Thatcher. What that really means is that, I grew up in Europe, where socialism produced something of a disaster economically. I come to the United States, where capitalism has done a rather good job. I like everything that you've talked about, but I worry about, in a way, what I seem to think is the solution, which is a more socialist environment. And the bottom line is, I think you've got to separate good capitalism from bad capitalism, and good government from bad government, and somehow figure out a way that gets good capitalism and good government in the same space.
Thank you. And let me just say that
Good government is what separates good capitalism from bad capitalism. It is precisely the role of good government to do that, and it's our role to separate good government from bad government, something we haven't been doing very well as citizens recently. But that has nothing to do with socialism. Socialism is creating a command economy in which government becomes the decision maker with respect to all economic decisions. Nobody's arguing that. We're talking about democracy overseeing, regulating, and making sure that good capitalism is given full freedom and bad capitalism is curtailed and restrained. That's exactly the job. Let's come back quickly over you, sir, have had your hand up for a long time, so why don't you come? And the two of you will finish. I think those are the last two. We'll finish up.
Hi. I wanted to ask you about what your thoughts were in terms of my generation expresses itself. I get the sense that with MySpace and blogging and a lot of the other new technologies that are out there, that people young people are sort of marketing themselves, making themselves into a product, trying to push themselves either to get into college or to get one of those particular like high-banking positions that seem to be all over the city, or just to sell themselves, or to grasp that little bit of fame that seems to be more important than any other value that's out there. I'm wondering, how do you break free from that?
Yes, I mean, you're right. The targeting of young people, which goes down to 10, is very much about, boy, this new technology is here, very incessant, isn't it? It's somebody has it in a bag and nobody knows where, but it stopped finally.
I'm really sorry, I turned it off. But
Okay, thank you, that's okay. But what is true is that the targeting of young people means, for example, I write about something called buzz marketing. Marketers will go to teenagers and say, we will give you free products and pay you to pretend you like them. You go around to your peers because they won't respond to us advertisers. We're stupid adults. But if you go around and say, man, I have this great new perfume, or have you heard this great new record? They get paid to do it, just like the doctors get paid to, give the medicines to people who don't need them. So there's that kind of abuse that goes on. There's the direct targeting of children that goes on. But my experience, by the way, has been that there's a lot of resilience, that young people, because they've been subjected to this, have become very media savvy. That doesn't mean media resistant necessarily, but it does mean media savvy. I think there are a lot of young people who are looking for ways to resist, to rebel, to not be taken in by that. And for every kid who sells his forehead in college to a commercial logo, and there are a lot of kids who do that now, they actually sell themselves to an advertising. So they put a logo on their forehead and wander around the college campus, selling something. And we've seen professional basketball players with their hair, with commercial logos in their hairdos and so on. The human body is being turned into a billboard as part of this pervasive new commercialism. But right next to that, I think I see among a lot of young people a kind of resistance to that. And a lot of young people with whom I've talked about this, come to me and say, yeah, some kids, yeah, but not me. I know what's going on, and I'm doing something about it. So I'm somewhat hopeful that you will find genuine internal resistance. After all, people lived under the Soviet Empire for 80 years, and in a year or two, the whole thing went under. I think living under the tyranny of market capitalism is much less onerous, and I suspect it's going to be possible for young people to find their way out once they begin to figure out what the alternatives are. So on that score, I feel perhaps more optimistic than you do. Last question here. Yeah.
My initial question was sort of answered, so I'm going to perhaps play a role of provocateur here. But I'd like to know in what ways you think that the left or leftist ideology has hindered a real attempt to create some rules and standards and limits, things that the left has not always been great at.
A very good question to end on too, because first of all, let me say the libertarian instinct, that sort of anarcho-libertarian instinct, is at both ends of the spectrum. You'll find it on the far right, Pat Buchanan. To the right of Pat Buchanan, you'll certainly find it, on the far left as well. But the more general question of where the left has maybe not done as much as it can, I agree with you. Starting in the 60s with a counterculture, it very definitely licensed a kind of notion that anything goes and that personal, getting whatever you want is what it's about. And I'm just reading Timothy Leary's biography, and you want to see an account of, the drug culture in the 60s and how it became kind of the official culture, not just of the left, but of an awful lot of Americans, where, again, anything goes and doing what I want and do your own thing and, I'm okay, you're okay. That whole kind of, which is part of the American individualist thing, is very, very powerful. And the left certainly has bought into it, and for a long time used words like square or conservative, to describe people who actually cared about values and were looking for some stability and security in their lives and wanted to care about other people and so on. And I think the left, has been guilty of maybe to some degree buying into that and allowing that to dominate and to refuse to take seriously the role of values. Now that isn't the case. David Callahan Of course, you know, if you're in a Christian community or even a predominantly Christian community, you want to have a crash in the village square. And if you can't, you know, or you put 12 different religious symbols, and so every person has it, you trivialize all of them before you're through. And there's got to be something between the trivialization and total privatization of religion and the dominance of one religion over all else. But, you know, we Americans on the left particularly, the ACLU and so on, seems to me to have begun to think that any sign of religion anywhere, you know, is appalling, and that has actually helped not just denude the public square of its moral and religious significance, but to really take away a lot of the qualities most Americans care about. So I think you're right to say those have to be concerns. Obviously, we also have to be concerned with minority rights and the rights of people who don't share those religious beliefs and the people who have a different moral point of view and so on. But on the whole, the left, I think, has erred in the direction of license, of anything goes, of I don't give a damn, of je m'en fous, and so on, you know, of 68 in Paris, and that has really done it harm, and to some degree lost it the majority it once had, where economic issues are not any longer powerful enough, even where people are economically hurting, to, you know, allow them to vote Democratic because they're so appalled by what they see as the moral laxity of the left. So those are very good questions. I don't think they're easy answers to them, but certainly commercial capitalism, you know, is something around which I think both the right and the left that cares about these issues can begin to unite in the way some of you were talking about, and hold out real hope. And that's why Demos calls itself nonpartisan. That's not just an escape clause so it can get funding. I mean, it really does, I think, believe that the fundamental issues America faces are not issues of right or left, but are issues of what kind of public life we want, what kind of democracy we want, what kind of country we want to live in. And there, I think you will find affinities across the board that your question reflects. So thank you very much for ending there. Thank you all. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming. If you haven't signed up, if you just came tonight for the first time, make sure you leave us your email address. We're building our list, we're building our events, and I want to thank Professor Barber.